Hey guys, tonight we step back into the year 1912 to a quiet town in Iowa, where the air is thick with the scent of fresh-cut timber and dust. It's a sleepy little place where the trees sway gently in the summer breeze and the sound of footsteps echoes against the narrow streets. But beneath this serene facade lies a chilling story, one that has lingered in the shadows for over a century. As night falls over Villisca, the stars twinkle above like distant lanterns casting a pale, ghostly light over the landscape. The town, though small, has a history shrouded in darkness, a history that still haunts the land to this very day. On the night of June 9th, 1912, something horrific unfolded here. An entire family, 6 lives in total, met a gruesome end in their home, their lives cut short in the most brutal way imaginable. But as the years have passed, something more sinister has emerged from this tragedy. Whispers of supernatural events, strange occurrences, and restless spirits have clung to the remnants of the Villisca axe murder case. The victims, it is said, have never truly left. Their souls, trapped in the anguish of their violent deaths, continue to haunt the small town of Villisca, waiting for someone to listen, to uncover the truth. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The house still standing today holds a terrible secret within its walls. You can feel it the moment you step onto the creaky porch, the wind whispering through the trees as if it carries the voices of those who once lived here. The home, once full of laughter and warmth, now sits in cold silence, its windows staring blankly out at the road like empty eyes. The faint traces of the past linger in the air, a quiet reminder of the horrific events that transpired within. As we begin, imagine the scene. It's late, long past midnight. A full moon casts a pale, eerie glow over the house, the shadows stretching out like dark fingers across the ground. Inside the house is still almost too still, as if it holds its breath. The air feels thick, oppressive, like it's waiting for something to happen, for something to break the silence. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, the Moore family sleeps. Josiah and Sarah, the parents, along with their 4 children, Herman, Catherine Boyd, and Paul, rest in their beds, unaware that death is creeping closer with each passing second. The clock ticks quietly in the corner, the only sound breaking the stillness. But outside, a figure moves through the shadows. His footsteps are silent, his presence unnoticed by the family. The man, a stranger to the town, had been watching the house for days. He knew the patterns, the routines of the Moore family. He knew they would be sleeping soundly, unaware of the approaching danger. And so, with the precision of a predator, he entered the house under the cover of darkness. The axe was his weapon, the instrument of death he would use to end 6 lives that night. He crept into the first bedroom where Josiah and Sarah lay. The weight of the axe felt heavy in his hands, its blade gleaming under the moonlight that filtered through the window. With a single swift motion, he brought it down. The sound was muffled like a wet thud against flesh, but it was enough to wake the sleeping couple. They never had a chance. The killer worked quickly, methodically, moving from room to room. The children, each tucked safely in their beds, were no more prepared than their parents. Boyd, just 7 years old, was the first to feel the cold touch of death. He never even saw it coming, the axe descending with brutal force. His tiny body was no match for the power of the strike. Catherine, only 9, was next. She awoke to the sound of the blow and tried to scream, but her voice was silenced before it could echo through the house. Her death was quick, but no less violent. Herman, the eldest child at 11, fought back. He struggled. He tried to run, but the killer was faster, more relentless. In moments, he too was lying still, his life taken in the blink of an eye. The house, which had once been full of joy, now lay in a horrifying silence, each room filled with the weight of death. The only sound that could be heard was the soft creak of the floorboards under the killer's footsteps, his task nearly complete. But the horror didn't end there. As the killer stood over his victims, he lingered for a moment longer, the air thick with the sense of something waiting. There was no hurry to escape, no rush to flee. He took his time, wiping the blood from the axe, making sure no trace of his presence was left behind. The killer wasn't just taking lives. He was leaving behind a message that would linger in the town for years to come. When the morning light broke over Villisca, it found the house eerily still, the world outside unaware of the nightmare unfolding inside. The townspeople began their daily routines, but something was amiss. There was an unsettling quiet in the air, an absence of sound that made every step feel too loud, too intrusive. It wasn't long before the silence was broken. A neighbor, noticing the Moore family's absence, went to check on them. What they found in that house would never be forgotten. The horror that awaited them was like something out of a nightmare. Josiah and Sarah Moore, their children all lying lifeless, their bodies frozen in time, blood staining the once pristine floors of the home. The town of Villisca was plunged into shock, and the investigation began. But despite the many theories and the countless questions, the truth of what happened that night was never uncovered. The killer was never caught, and the mystery of the Villisca axe murders remains unsolved to this day. And though the years have passed, the house still stands waiting. The spirits of the Moore family, it is said, are still trapped there, their restless souls never having found peace. The chilling presence of their deaths clings to the house like a dark stain, and those who dare to step inside often report strange occurrences. Cold spots, eerie sounds, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. The spirits, they say, are still searching for justice, still waiting for someone to listen. As the days passed and the investigation into the Villisca axe murders dragged on the town of Villisca, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Despite the efforts of local law enforcement and the many theories that arose, no concrete answers emerged. The killer, whoever he was, seemed to vanish into the night, leaving behind only a trail of blood and unanswered questions. But the darkness didn't just linger in the house, it seeped into the town itself. Villisca, once a quiet, peaceful place, became a town haunted not only by the specter of the murders, but by the growing sense that something supernatural had taken root. The air felt heavier now, thick with an unspoken tension, as though the town itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. It was around this time that whispers began to spread about the house. People reported strange occurrences when they passed by, even in the daytime. Some claimed to see shadows moving behind the curtained windows, though the house was clearly empty. Others spoke of a cold chill that would suddenly descend even on the warmest of summer days. The sensation was unsettling, as if the house itself was aware of the town's growing unease, feeding off the fear that began to fester in the air. One evening, just as dusk fell over the town, a group of local teenagers dared each other to enter the house. The story of the Villisca axe murders had become the stuff of legend, and like many legends, it called to those who sought thrills in the face of fear. Armed with little more than flashlights and bravado, they crept into the house, each step echoing in the silence. Inside, the house was in disarray, as if the world had stood still the moment the murders occurred. The furniture remained covered in dust, with the faintest traces of the past still clinging to the surfaces. It was as though the house had been frozen in time, stuck in that one horrific moment. But there was something else, something more than just the remnants of a tragic event. The air was thick with a palpable heaviness, an oppressive presence that made it difficult to breathe. As the teenagers explored the upstairs rooms, they began to feel the weight of something unseen watching them. They dismissed it as nerves, telling each other it was just the atmosphere of the house getting to them. But then, in the silence of the upstairs bedroom where the Moore family had been murdered, something truly unsettling happened. One of the teens, a girl named Emily, had wandered away from the group. She had found herself standing near the very bed where Catherine Moore had been slain. She looked around her flashlight, trembling in her hand, as she scanned the room. It was then that she heard it, the soft sound of breathing slow and labored coming from the corner of the room. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned, but there was nothing there, just the empty, dust-filled space of the room. "Guys," she called out, her voice shaking. "Did you hear that?" Her friends who had been exploring the room across the hall rushed over, but when they entered the room, it was empty. Emily's flashlight flickered, casting strange, eerie shadows on the walls as they looked around, but no one else had heard anything. They tried to laugh it off, but the tension in the room was thick, now palpable. Each of them felt it, the eyes on them, the sense that something else was present, something that wasn't just part of the house, but part of the tragedy that had unfolded here. As they made their way back downstairs, they heard another sound, a low, almost imperceptible scrape, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. They froze. The air felt colder, and the shadows seemed to grow darker, more menacing. They didn't stay much longer. The next day, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her back from the house. Every corner she turned, she felt it, eyes watching, breath on the back of her neck. Her dreams were filled with visions of the Moore family, their faces frozen in terror as the axe descended. And no matter how hard she tried to shake the thoughts from her mind, they clung to her like a dark cloud that wouldn't dissipate. It wasn't long before other residents of Villisca began to experience similar sensations. The house had become a point of obsession for the townsfolk, an eerie landmark that stood as a grim reminder of the past. They'd hear whispers at night, faint but distinct, like a soft murmur coming from the house. Some even reported seeing figures in the windows, though the house was always locked and abandoned. One local historian, intrigued by the strange happenings, decided to investigate further. He spent countless hours researching the history of the murders and the house itself, seeking any clue that might explain what had happened and why the spirits of the Moore family still lingered. What he uncovered was both chilling and mysterious. It seemed that the house was built on land that had once been the site of an ancient burial ground. Some believed that the restless spirits of the indigenous people who had once lived there still haunted the land, their anger and sorrow, fueling the evil that had taken root in the house. Others claimed that the killer himself was cursed, drawn to the house by forces beyond his control. The historian's findings only added to the growing sense of unease in the town. The house, it seemed, was more than just a place where a tragedy had occurred. It was a nexus, a point where the past and present collided, where the spirits of the dead still lingered, searching for answers, for justice, for peace. But the killer was never found. The case remained unsolved, a mystery that only added to the house's cursed reputation. And as the years went by, more and more people came to Villisca, drawn by the stories of the haunting, only to leave with the same unsettling feeling, an awareness that something unseen was watching, waiting. The house still stands to this day, though no one dares live in it. The town has long since moved on, but the legacy of the Villisca axe murders remains, its ghosts lingering in the hearts of those who remember. And for those who dare to visit the whispers of the past, still haunt the air. The restless spirits of the Moore family are said to walk the halls forever, searching for answers forever trapped in the night that claimed their lives. Years passed, and the town of Villisca settled into a quiet routine, though the shadow of the axe murders still loomed large. Life moved on as it tends to do. But there were always whispers about the house, especially at night when the wind would blow and the trees would sway in the moonlight. For those who dared to venture close, the air seemed different near the house, a subtle, unsettling shift, as if the very ground beneath their feet held a secret it couldn't share. In the summer of 1928, a local man named Jacob, a well-respected farmer in Villisca, passed by the house one evening. He had lived in the town for years and had heard the stories, of course, but never given much thought to the rumors. The house was just another old building like so many others in the town, and he'd never experienced anything unusual until that night. As he walked past, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the road. Jacob noticed that the front door of the house, always locked and tightly shut, was slightly ajar. The sight stopped him in his tracks. He hadn't seen anyone go inside, and yet the door was open, a silent invitation to something beyond the threshold. Curiosity gripped him, and before he knew it, he found himself walking closer, drawn by an invisible force. The moment his foot stepped onto the porch, the temperature dropped. It wasn't just a sudden chill. It was as if the very air had thickened, each breath becoming heavier, more difficult to take. He paused, thinking of turning back, but something compelled him to continue. Slowly, cautiously, Jacob reached the door. As his hand hovered over the worn wooden handle, he hesitated, uncertain if he should enter. But the door creaked, as if beckoning him inside. With a nervous breath, he pushed it open and stepped into the dim interior of the house. The air was stale, filled with the scent of dust and age, and the faintest trace of something metallic like old blood. The house, as always, was still. The only sounds were the echo of his boots on the floor and the wind moaning outside. But it wasn't the silence that unsettled him. It was the feeling that something was waiting, something unseen, something alive within the walls. He made his way through the house, each room as empty as the last. The furniture was draped in sheets, a ghostly reminder of lives that had once filled this space. Jacob couldn't help but feel the weight of the house pressing down on him, as if it were alive, aware of his presence. As he moved further into the house, he reached the top of the stairs. The faintest sound came from behind him, a soft creak of the floorboards. He spun around, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no signs of life. The silence was oppressive, thick enough to suffocate. But just as he was about to turn and leave, he noticed something strange. At the end of the hallway, in the room where the Moore family had been murdered, the door stood slightly open. His heart skipped a beat, and his breath caught in his throat. It was the room where they had died. The thought of stepping inside filled him with dread, but a strange force pulled him forward, compelling him to move closer. As he approached the room, the air grew colder, the silence even more pronounced. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing the dimly lit space. The room appeared unchanged, frozen in time. The bed, still unmade, sat eerily in the center of the room, the same bed where Catherine Moore had met her end. The very air in this room seemed to pulse with a low, eerie hum, as if the house was alive, beating with a rhythm of its own. Jacob stepped inside his boots, echoing on the floor. The temperature dropped further, and he shivered, unsure whether it was from the cold or the sense of something watching him unseen and waiting. He walked around the room, his flashlight casting long shadows across the walls. His eyes were drawn to the window, where the moonlight filtered through the glass, casting an unnatural glow across the room. There, in the corner, was something he hadn't noticed before. A figure. It was faint at first, barely visible in the shadows, but as he moved closer, the outline of a figure took shape. A woman, pale and translucent, standing still, her eyes locked on him. She appeared to be trapped in the room, just as the others were. Her expression was one of sorrow, but also of something more fear, and a deep, unyielding sadness. Jacob froze his breath, catching in his throat. He knew this was no ordinary vision. This was a spirit, a soul trapped in this house by something far more malevolent than he could comprehend. The figure seemed to reach out her hand, extending toward him, as if begging for help, begging for release from her eternal torment. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the figure vanished. The room grew cold again, the hum of the house fading into an eerie silence. Jacob stood there, paralyzed by the vision, his mind racing to understand what he had just witnessed. Had it been real? Or had the house twisted his perception, feeding on his fear? He didn't wait to find out. With shaking hands, he turned and fled the house, the door slamming shut behind him as he stumbled out into the cool night air. His heart raced in his chest, his thoughts swirling in a haze of confusion and fear. He knew deep down that what he had seen was no illusion. The house was cursed, haunted by the restless spirits of the Moore family, their deaths forever bound to this place. The next morning, Jacob tried to shake off the fear, telling himself it was just his imagination. But the unease lingered, gnawing at him. Every time he passed by the house, he felt a chill run down his spine, as if the walls themselves were watching him. He never spoke of what he had seen, but the terror that gripped him was undeniable. And as the years passed, more and more people came to the house, drawn by the stories, the whispers of hauntings and restless souls. Some said they saw shadows moving behind the curtains. Others heard whispers in the wind. But no one stayed long, and the house remained a dark monument to the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. The spirits of the Moore family, it seemed, had never found peace, and the house, forever marked by their deaths, stood as a grim reminder of the past, its windows empty, its doors ajar, waiting for the next soul to wander in. As the decades drifted by, the legend of the Villisca Axe murders grew, and with it, the strange happenings surrounding the house. The once quiet town became a point of fascination for those drawn to the supernatural, a place where whispers in the night mingled with the wind, and the past seemed to never truly let go. Tourists began to trickle into Villisca, eager to glimpse the infamous house, to feel its cold embrace, or perhaps to uncover some hidden truth that had remained elusive for over 40 years. But for the townspeople, the house had become a quiet terror, an unwanted reminder of the violence and the spirits that refused to move on. Over the years, more and more people reported eerie encounters. Some said they had seen figures in the windows, while others heard disembodied footsteps in the night. Every account, though vague, shared one thing in common: the overwhelming sense that the house was never truly empty, that the souls of those who had died there still lingered. In the summer of 1955, a local couple, Charlie and Emma, decided to take a risk. They were newlyweds, eager to start their life together, and in the spirit of their shared love of history and mystery, they decided to buy the house. They believed the rumors were just that, rumors. There was no real harm, no danger in living in a house with a past, no matter how tragic. But their excitement quickly turned to horror, as strange occurrences escalated almost immediately. It started with small things: barely noticeable doors left ajar when they were certain they had locked them, flickering lights when the electricity was fine, and a persistent feeling of being watched. Emma, who had a keen sense of intuition, was the first to feel it, the cold presence in the house. At night, when the shadows stretched long across the walls, she would feel something brush against her skin, a faint whisper of a touch. She brushed it off, telling herself it was just the house, settling the natural creaks and groans of an old building. But one night, as the couple sat in the living room, Emma heard it again, the sound of footsteps. This time it was unmistakable. The floorboards creaked under the weight of someone walking just behind her. Charlie, who had been reading, turned to look at her. But when she turned to face him, she saw the same thing he did, a shadow moving across the hallway. A figure too faint to make out clearly, but undeniably present. Charlie. Emma's voice trembled as she spoke. "Did you see that?" He nodded, his face pale. "I did. And I don't think we're alone here." That night, they didn't sleep. The house seemed to come alive around them, the walls groaning and creaking, as if they were shifting, as if they were closing in on the couple. Every sound, every movement felt deliberate, like something was trying to get their attention, trying to make them understand something. By the end of the week, Emma and Charlie were terrified. They had heard the whispers faint, but constant, like a soft murmur that echoed through the house. Sometimes it was a voice they couldn't quite make out, and other times it was as if the house itself was speaking, grinding, creaking, whispering the names of those long gone. Emma could barely sleep, her dreams haunted by images of the Moore family, their faces frozen in terror as they fell to the floor beneath the axe. Then came the final straw. It was a stormy night, the kind of night where the wind howls like the voices of the damned, and the rain beats against the windows like a relentless drum. The couple had tried to fall asleep, but the feeling of being watched had grown unbearable. Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling, when she heard the sound of someone moving in the hallway. This time it wasn't faint, it wasn't distant. It was close enough to make her heart race. She shook Charlie awake. "Did you hear that someone's here?" Charlie, still groggy from sleep, listened. At first, all he could hear was the storm outside. But then, as the wind howled louder, he too heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving through the hallway. He got up, determined to confront whoever was in the house. But when he opened the door, the hallway was empty. The house was silent again, save for the storm. A chill ran down Charlie's spine as he closed the door behind him. "It's nothing," he said, trying to calm his wife. "Just the storm." But Emma knew better. This wasn't just the storm. It was the house, the presence, the spirits of the Moore family. And as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, the presence in the house more demanding, until Charlie and Emma could no longer deny it. Something was there, something that had been waiting for them. The house, it seemed, had not forgotten. It was still alive with the pain of its past. The following morning, Emma and Charlie left the house. They couldn't bear to stay another night. The house with its secrets and its ghosts had claimed them. They never returned, and so the house remained standing against the passage of time. Over the years, many have tried to live there, but all have fled. No one has been able to remain for long. The spirits of the Moore family, those who had suffered such a brutal and senseless death, still walk the halls of the Villisca Axe murder house, searching for peace, searching for justice, and for those who dare to visit the house, never forgets. It whispers to you, pulling you deeper into its dark history, until you too are caught in its eternal grip, just like so many before you. The restless souls of the Moore family continue to haunt the house, waiting for someone to finally uncover the truth behind their tragic deaths. But the truth, it seems, will remain hidden in the shadows forever. The house with its peeling paint, and creaking floorboards will stand as a silent monument to the horrors that unfolded within. And those who venture near will hear the whispers in the wind, the soft murmur of the past calling them to listen to, understand, and to never forget. As the years bled into decades, the Villisca Axe murder house became more than just a relic of the past. It became an object of macabre fascination. The whispers of the dead, the restless spirits, the eerie murmurs. These tales had spread far and wide, drawing more and more curious souls to the house. Some came hoping to uncover the truth, while others simply sought the thrill of standing where such horror had once unfolded. But for those who lived in Villisca, the house was a constant, a dark reminder that the past never truly disappears. Even those who had lived their entire lives in the town couldn't escape the shadow that hung over the place. The house, with its broken windows and fading walls, seemed to breathe with an otherworldly pulse, as though it were still alive, still feeding on the pain and anguish of those who had died there. In the early 1980s, a journalist named Rebecca Monroe decided to visit the house, hoping to write a piece that would shed light on the history of the Villisca Axe murders. She was skeptical about the rumors, having heard the stories countless times, but never truly believing in them. After all, she was a journalist, a woman of facts, of evidence, of reason. Ghosts and hauntings were things of myth, right? Rebecca arrived in Villisca on a crisp autumn evening. The town was quiet, its streets empty as the sun dipped below the horizon. She parked her car near the house, the faint silhouette of the old structure standing against the darkening sky. The house looked exactly as it always had, the same hollow stare from its windows, the same oppressive air that seemed to cling to it. With a deep breath, she stepped out of her car, her feet crunching the gravel beneath her. Her flashlight cut through the growing darkness as she made her way up to the front porch. She could feel the weight of the house bearing down on her, a presence so strong it almost made her hesitate. But she was determined. She wasn't going to be swayed by superstition or hearsay. Rebecca pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. The interior was exactly as she had imagined it, dusty, abandoned, and frozen in time. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of age and decay. She moved through the house, her flashlight illuminating the rooms as she documented everything she saw. But the further she went, the more unsettled she became. The house was silent, but the silence felt wrong, unnatural, thick with something unspoken. As she made her way to the upstairs, she felt the temperature drop, a coldness seeping into her bones. She rubbed her arms, trying to stave off the chill, but it only seemed to grow worse. She had read about the temperature shifts in the house. People had said the house had a way of making you feel the cold, as if it were alive, breathing with the spirits of the past. Rebecca reached the room where the Moore family had met their end. The floorboards groaned under her weight as she stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. It was hard to breathe in here, as though the air itself had become heavier, more suffocating. She scanned the room with her flashlight, taking in the bed where the children had once slept, the spot where the axe had fallen. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something. A shadow. A flicker of movement, too quick to fully register. Her pulse quickened, and she turned toward it. The room was empty, save for the remnants of the past. But the sensation, the unmistakable feeling of being watched, lingered. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body tense, every nerve on edge. She stepped further into the room, the floor creaking with each movement. Her flashlight beam swept across the walls, but nothing seemed to explain the strange chill in the air. She had read about the alleged hauntings, but this was different. It was more than just a story. It was something real. And then it came, a soft sound like a whisper coming from the darkness. Rebecca froze, her heart racing. The whisper was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there, just on the edge of hearing. She stepped back, her eyes darting around the room, but there was no one there, just the oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of her own breath. Another whisper, clearer this time. "Help us!" Rebecca's blood ran cold. The voice was faint, trembling as if it were coming from deep within the walls themselves. The temperature dropped further, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She wanted to run to escape the house, but her feet were rooted to the spot, unable to move. The whispers grew louder now, a chorus of voices, faint but unmistakable. "Please, help us." The house seemed to close in on her, its walls pressing in as if the very building was alive, breathing in time with the voices. Rebecca's chest tightened, and she gasped for air, the panic rising within her. She stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering as she turned toward the door. But before she could reach it, the whispers stopped. Everything fell silent. The silence was deafening. Her flashlight flickered one last time before it went out completely. She stood in the dark, heart-pounding eyes wide with fear. Her hands trembled as she fumbled to turn the flashlight back on. When the light finally flickered to life, the room was empty again. The voices were gone, replaced by the thick, suffocating silence. Rebecca ran from the house, her breath ragged as she stumbled through the door and out into the night. The whispers followed her, though, lingering in the back of her mind. She drove back to her hotel, her mind racing, her heart still beating wildly in her chest. What had she heard? What had she experienced? She never published her article. The house, the voices, the feeling of being watched, it was all too much to comprehend. And even though she tried to convince herself it had been nothing more than a trick of the mind, she knew deep down that it hadn't been. The house still stood waiting for the next curious soul to enter, to feel its dark presence, to hear its whispers. And the spirits of the Moore family, their souls still trapped within its walls, continued to cry out, begging for someone to listen, to remember them. Decades turned into centuries, and the story of the Villisca axe murders continued to be whispered about, passed down through generations. The house, however, stood still, a mute testament to the horrific tragedy it housed. In the early 2000s, the town of Villisca, once quiet and untouched by the outside world, began to see an influx of tourists. The house had become a popular stop for those seeking chills and eerie fascination that took root in the darkest corners of curiosity. People came from across the country, lured by the mysteries surrounding the place, hoping to catch a glimpse of something they could not explain. But as the crowds grew, so did the stories of the house's power. Local residents who had lived in the town their entire lives spoke of the unnatural events they had witnessed and heard. Some told tales of waking in the night to the sound of screams, only to find their neighbors' houses as quiet as always. Others spoke of seeing the Moore family's faces in the windows, their eyes wide with terror. Most unsettling of all were the reports of visitors who never returned, who had entered the house but left no trace of their presence. It was as if they had vanished without a word. One such visitor, a man named Michael, arrived in Villisca one stormy night in 2011. Michael was a paranormal investigator known for his deep skepticism about supernatural claims. He had spent his career debunking ghost stories, seeking logical explanations for the strange happenings people claimed to experience. But when he arrived in Villisca, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about the axe murder house. He had heard the rumors, of course, but he believed they were nothing more than urban legends. Stories spun to entertain, not to frighten. Michael set up his equipment in the house, prepared to spend the night inside. His team of investigators arrived a few hours later, bringing with them cameras, infrared sensors, and EVP recorders. They were determined to capture evidence of the supernatural to prove once and for all whether the whispers and sightings were real or just products of overactive imaginations. The house standing in the shadows of the storm seemed to watch them as they moved inside. The first few hours were uneventful. The group moved through the house, their equipment recording nothing out of the ordinary. The temperature remained steady, and no strange noises interrupted their investigations. But as the night wore on, something began to shift. It was subtle at first, just a change in the air, a thickening of the atmosphere. As the clock ticked past midnight, the temperature began to drop. Michael noticed it first, his breath coming out in small clouds as he spoke to his team. It was as though the house itself had exhaled, releasing a cold, damp breath that clung to their skin. Then came the sounds. At first, it was just a faint creaking, as though the house were shifting in its sleep. But soon, it grew louder. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, began to echo through the hallways. Michael's heart raced as he turned to his team, but they were just as confused as he was. No one was moving, and yet the footsteps continued growing closer with each passing moment. They followed the sound, moving cautiously through the darkened house, their flashlights flickering. The footsteps led them to the staircase, where the air felt colder. Still, the walls seemingly closing in around them. The team hesitated, but Michael, ever the skeptic, pressed forward, convinced that there had to be a logical explanation. But then they heard something else. A whisper so faint that it was almost imperceptible. The voice was a low murmur, repeating the same phrase over and over, just beyond the reach of their ears. "Help us. Please. Help us." Michael felt a chill run through his body. He had spent years in haunted locations, and yet nothing had ever felt quite like this. The house seemed alive with something malevolent, something ancient, as though the spirits of the past were trying to communicate. The air thickened, becoming almost oppressive, as if the very walls were pressing in on them. The whisper grew louder. "Help us, please. Help us." The team gathered together, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light of their flashlights. They turned their cameras toward the stairs, hoping to catch something, anything that could explain what was happening. But the room was empty. The house was silent again, the whispers gone as quickly as they had come. But Michael knew it wasn't over. He could feel it. Something had changed in the house. It wasn't the same as before. The house had been waiting for them. They decided to leave their investigation abruptly cut short. As they exited the house, Michael felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but the sense of unease lingered. They had captured nothing. No evidence on their cameras, no footage to validate what they had experienced. But Michael knew the truth. They had been in the presence of something beyond explanation. The storm outside had died down by the time they reached their cars. The winds had stopped the rain, a mere mist in the air. But as Michael looked back at the house, he saw something, a shadow in the window, a face staring out at him. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he thought he saw the figure of a woman, her eyes wide with fear. He quickly turned away, his breath catching in his throat. He drove away from the house that night, never to return. Months later, when Michael published his findings, he did so reluctantly. He included all of his recordings, the ones that seemed to show nothing out of the ordinary. But in his personal notes tucked away at the back of the report, he wrote something that he couldn't quite explain. The house is waiting. And whatever is in there, whatever is haunting that place, it's not finished. The Moore family, their spirits, they're still trying to tell us something. The house is a prison for them, and until someone listens, until someone uncovers the truth, they will never be free. And so the Villisca Axe murder house remains standing against the ravages of time, its story still unresolved. The spirits of the Moore family trapped within its walls, continue to reach out to those who dare to enter, whispering for help, for justice, for peace. But until the truth is uncovered, the house will stand as a dark monument to a past that refuses to die. The years marched on, and the whispers of the Villisca axe murder house persisted, as they always would. Time, as it has a way of doing, erased the personal histories of those who lived in Villisca, but the haunting presence of the house, the lingering souls, the unanswered questions, it remained. It became woven into the fabric of the town's identity. And though many tried to dismiss it, the house continued to cast its dark shadow. In 2023, an ambitious documentary filmmaker named Jonathan Keller decided to tackle the story of the Villisca axe murders once and for all. Jonathan had spent years working on true crime documentaries, but he had never encountered a case quite like this. The combination of historical tragedy, local folklore, and the haunting allure of the house itself made it irresistible. He believed that with modern technology and the right investigative approach, he could uncover the truth behind the murders. Jonathan arrived in Villisca in early September, when the town still had the remnants of summer's warmth. The leaves were just beginning to turn, casting the streets in hues of gold and red. He set up his base in a small bed and breakfast, a cozy spot run by a woman named Ruth, who had lived in Villisca for most of her life. Ruth was familiar with the stories, of course, but she was also weary of them. She had grown up hearing the hushed voices of the elders who had witnessed the aftermath of the murders, and over the years, she had learned to dismiss them as mere local legend. But as she looked at Jonathan, determined and wide-eyed, she couldn't help but wonder if he too would walk away with more than he bargained for. Jonathan wasted no time securing access to the house and preparing for his investigation. Unlike the other curious visitors who had come before him, he wasn't just there to feel the atmosphere or capture the faintest evidence of a haunting. He was determined to solve the mystery of the Villisca axe murders. Equipped with state-of-the-art cameras, voice recorders, thermal imaging devices, and even a team of historians and forensic specialists, Jonathan intended to leave no stone unturned. On the night of his investigation, Jonathan stood before the house, feeling the weight of history settle on his shoulders. The air felt thick, heavy with an inexplicable tension. The full moon hung high in the sky, casting a ghostly light over the porch. He took a deep breath, his mind racing with thoughts of what he might discover, hoping to uncover the killer, or at the very least to gain some understanding of why the spirits still lingered. "All right," Jonathan said, his voice firm yet tinged with unease. "Let's do this." Inside the house was silent as it always was. The faint scent of mildew and decay clung to the walls, but there was something else in the air, something sharp, like an unseen pressure pressing in from all sides. Jonathan felt it the moment he stepped through the threshold, that subtle but undeniable sense that the house was awake, watching. As the night progressed, Jonathan's team gathered their evidence, speaking with the historians who provided their expertise on the original murders and the forensic specialists who analyzed the crime scene photos and autopsy reports. The details were grisly, brutal even, but Jonathan's focus never wavered. He wanted answers, and he was convinced that this was the night he would find them. But as the hours passed, things began to take a strange turn. It began with a shift in the temperature. Jonathan's thermal imaging devices started to fluctuate erratically, the numbers on the screen changing from cold to warm in mere seconds. His team initially brushed it off as a glitch in the equipment, but Jonathan's gut told him otherwise. As the evening grew later, the temperature drops became more pronounced, so extreme that Jonathan could see his breath clouding in front of him. Then came the sounds. The first was subtle, a light scraping, like the sound of something shifting on the floor. At first, Jonathan thought it might have been a loose floorboard or an animal trapped somewhere in the walls. But when they investigated, they found nothing. The noises grew louder, more distinct. The creaking of the stairs, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the upstairs hallway. Jonathan's heart raced as he turned to his crew. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. They all nodded, the unease settling into their bones. They moved cautiously through the house, following the sounds, their footsteps muffled in the thick, oppressive air. As they reached the top of the stairs, the floor creaked beneath their weight, and the faintest whisper, a woman's voice, reached their ears. "Help us." Jonathan froze. His pulse quickened. There was no mistaking it. That was the same voice heard by others before him, the voice that had echoed through the rooms, pleading for something, for an end to the suffering. It was a voice from the past, the voice of someone who had never been allowed to rest. The team followed the voice, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had taken so many others before them. It led them to the room where the Moore family had been slaughtered. The door was slightly ajar, and as they stepped inside, the room seemed to grow colder still. Jonathan's flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deeper in the house, a violent, deafening sound that shook the very foundation of the building. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat as he turned to his team, their faces pale with fear. The house felt alive now, as though it was pushing them away, forcing them to leave. The team tried to gather themselves, but the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer the curiosity of a team conducting an investigation. It was something far more personal. The house had decided to take its toll on them. A cold, heavy hand pressed down on their chests, choking the air from their lungs. It was then that Jonathan felt the overwhelming sensation of being watched by eyes that had seen too much and that would never forget. A figure appeared in the corner of the room, a shadow against the wall. It was faint, nearly invisible. But as Jonathan's eyes focused, he saw the outline of a woman, her eyes wide with terror, her hands pressed against the wall as though trying to escape. Her face was pale, drawn in agony, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving only the echoes of its presence in the air. Jonathan's team fled the house, their equipment abandoned, their minds shaken to the core. They didn't speak of what had happened as they left, too afraid to vocalize the horror they had just witnessed. They knew in their hearts that something far darker than they could have ever imagined lived within the walls of the Villisca Axe murder house. For Jonathan, the mystery remained. The house still stood silent, waiting its secrets, buried deep within the floors, in the walls, and in the air. And the spirits of the Moore family, forever trapped, still cried out for justice, for release from the agony of their untold story. The house would not rest, and neither would they. Years passed, and the haunting stories of the Villisca Axe murder house continued to echo through the generations. The house, though worn and fading, stood resilient against the passage of time, its walls cradling the tragic history of the Moore family. Villisca had grown into a quiet, unassuming town again, but the house remained as a dark monument to the past, a place that people both feared and revered. Even those who had never visited spoke of the house in hushed tones, as if by acknowledging it aloud, they might somehow invoke the spirits that lingered there. In 2035, a group of paranormal researchers from across the globe gathered to investigate the Villisca house. They were part of a project to document the most notorious haunted places in the world. The team, led by Dr. Samuel Bennett, an experienced and well-respected parapsychologist, was prepared for everything, from subtle temperature shifts to full-on apparitions. But what they encountered that autumn night was something none of them could have prepared for. Dr. Bennett and his team arrived under a blanket of fog, the mist curling around the house like ghostly fingers. It was the perfect setting for the investigation. The house bathed in an ethereal, unsettling glow as the town around it lay still. The wind was still, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as though nature itself was holding its breath. The team set up their equipment, just as so many others had before them. Cameras were placed strategically throughout the house, infrared thermometers and EMF detectors dotted the rooms, and motion sensors were set in every corner. Dr. Bennett was skeptical of the paranormal, even after years of research. He had seen evidence of strange phenomena, sure, but he always believed there was a rational explanation behind it all, at least until tonight. As the night deepened, the house seemed to grow colder, and the team's breath became visible in the air. The eerie silence that had settled in the house felt oppressive, and the walls seemed to pulse with the weight of the past. Every creak of the floorboards, every subtle shift in the air, made them all tense, watching, waiting for something to break the monotony. And then something did. It began with a low hum, so faint that they almost missed it at first. But as they listened closer, the hum grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice barely audible at first, but unmistakable in its desperation. "Help us!" The voice was weak, trembling, as though it were coming from far away, from a place between worlds. Dr. Bennett motioned for his team to be silent to listen. The voice wasn't just a sound. It carried with it a sense of urgency, of a deep, unfulfilled need. The voice seemed to come from all directions, filling the space with its mournful plea. It echoed down the hallways and into the rooms, making the hairs on their necks stand on end. They moved cautiously through the house, the sound guiding them deeper into the building. The whispers grew louder as they approached the staircase leading to the second floor, the room where the Moore family had met their end. The team stood at the top of the stairs, looking down the dark hallway, the sound of the whispers now almost overwhelming. "Help us, please." Dr. Bennett's heart raced as he turned to his team, his skepticism slowly giving way to fear. He had heard of spirits trapped in places of trauma, but this was different. This wasn't just a lingering echo of the past. It felt as if the house itself was calling out to them, urging them to uncover the truth, to set the souls of the Moore family free. With their equipment in hand, the team moved toward the room where the murders had taken place. As they reached the door, the temperature dropped significantly, and the air grew heavier. Dr. Bennett felt it most acutely, a pressure, an oppressive weight, as though the room itself was holding its breath. He looked at his team, who were all visibly shaken. The whispers continued, becoming almost frantic. The door creaked as they pushed it open, and the temperature seemed to plummet further. The room was bathed in darkness, the only light coming from their flashlights, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The bed where the children had once slept, now empty, stood eerily in the corner, untouched by time. The furniture was covered in dust, the once vibrant colors faded into the dullness of decay. But there was something else in the air, something palpable, something that made their skin crawl. As Dr. Bennett stepped forward, he felt a sudden coldness rush over him, like an invisible hand pressing against his chest. The whispers grew louder now, almost deafening. They were no longer just distant voices. They were right beside him. The air shifted again, and in the corner of the room, a figure appeared. It was a woman, translucent and faint, but unmistakable. Her eyes were wide, filled with terror, and her mouth moved silently, as though she were trying to speak. Dr. Bennett's breath caught in his throat as the figure slowly moved toward him. It was the figure of a woman, Sarah Moore, the mother of the family, her form flickering in and out of existence like a candle struggling to stay alight. "Sarah," Dr. Bennett whispered, his voice trembling. The figure stopped in front of him, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. It was as though Sarah's spirit were trying to communicate something, trying to tell him something important. But then, the temperature dropped again, colder than before, and the figure faded, disappearing into the shadows. The whisper stopped. A heavy silence fell over the room, and Dr. Bennett stood frozen, unable to speak. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing to process what he had just witnessed. He had always believed that there was an explanation for everything but this. This was beyond explanation. It was as though Sarah Moore's spirit had reached out to him, urging him to understand, to uncover the truth of what had happened in that house. As the night wore on, the team captured strange readings on their equipment. Unexplainable spikes in temperature, sudden drops in the electromagnetic field, and sounds that couldn't be accounted for. But it wasn't until they left the house shaken to their core that they realized they had uncovered something far greater than they had intended. Dr. Bennett wrote in his report, one that he kept for himself and never published. The spirits in the Villisca house are not trapped by the house itself. They are trapped by the story, by the unanswered questions, the unresolved deaths. They seek justice not just for themselves, but for the truth that has been buried beneath years of mystery. The house may be haunted, but it is the truth that keeps the spirits restless. The Villisca axe murder house, as it turned out, was not just haunted by the dead, it was haunted by the questions they left behind. And until those questions were answered, the spirits of the Moore family would never rest. Despite the passage of time, the Villisca axe murder house remained a silent keeper of its dark secrets. The spirits of the Moore family, bound to the house by their brutal and unjust deaths, were not at rest. And yet, the world continued to move forward, and the house stood as a decaying monument to a past that no one could truly leave behind. In 2040, the house was sold to a private investor who, with grand plans, intended to transform the space into a museum dedicated to the history of the infamous murders. The new owner, an eccentric man named Arthur Miller, was a historian by trade, a man obsessed with cold cases and unsolved mysteries. He had visited Villisca years earlier, driven by the same curiosity that had gripped countless others before him. The house called to him, as it had to so many, a whisper of the past that refused to die. Arthur believed that by carefully preserving the house, he could finally uncover the truth, and in doing so, bring peace to the restless spirits. He worked tirelessly to restore the house to its former appearance, determined to create a space where visitors could learn the tragic story of the Moore family and the unknown killer who had forever scarred their lives. But from the moment he stepped inside, something felt wrong. It began with strange dreams. Arthur, who had never been one to believe in the supernatural, found himself waking in the middle of the night, his body drenched in sweat. The dreams were always the same: a figure standing in the doorway of the bedroom, their eyes wide with terror, blood staining their clothes. He could never see their face, only their outstretched hand, as though pleading for him to help them to understand what had happened. Each morning, he would dismiss the dreams, telling himself that the stories surrounding the house had simply gotten to him. But the feeling of being watched, the feeling that something or someone was always just out of sight, remained. The house itself seemed to breathe a subtle pressure in the air that made it impossible to ignore. Arthur chalked it up to his nerves and the isolation of working alone in such a place, but deep down he couldn't escape the sensation that he wasn't alone. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and cast the house in the familiar, eerie light of dusk, Arthur was in the upstairs room preparing for an upcoming tour. He had been setting up displays, cataloging the various artifacts related to the Moore family when he felt it again, the sudden oppressive cold that seemed to creep up from the floor, seeping into his bones. The air turned thick, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Then came the whisper. It was faint at first, a soft murmur that was barely audible. But Arthur, who had heard the tales of whispers in the house, froze his heart, thudding in his chest. He stood still, waiting for the sound to repeat, unsure of whether it was the wind the house settling, or something far more sinister. "Help us!" Arthur turned swiftly, his eyes scanning the room. There was no one there. The house was empty, as it always had been. But the whisper grew louder, and this time it wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping a chorus of voices, each one pleading desperate. "Please, help us." Arthur's breath quickened. His fingers trembled as he reached for the flashlight on the table, his mind racing. This wasn't just a sound in the wind or his imagination running wild. It felt real. The voices felt real. As he moved toward the source of the sound, the room grew colder still. The air pressed in on him as if the very walls were closing in. The whispers seemed to lead him to the corner of the room, to the spot where the Moore family had once slept. Arthur's flashlight flickered as he shone it across the floor, but he saw nothing unusual. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was there in that very corner waiting for him. Then a figure appeared. It was a woman, her face pale and drawn in anguish. Her clothes were old-fashioned, stained with blood. She stood just a few feet away from him, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth moving, but not making a sound. It was the same figure he had seen in his dreams, Sarah Moore, the mother. The moment their eyes met, Arthur felt a sharp, icy chill run through his veins. The woman's face twisted with sorrow, her expression pleading. She reached out toward him, her hand trembling, as if trying to communicate something, trying to force him to understand. Her eyes, so full of pain, seemed to pierce through him, and for a moment, Arthur could hear her voice in his head clear as day. "Find the truth." The figure began to fade, her body flickering like a dying light, but her voice lingered, reverberating in his mind long after she had disappeared. Find the truth. Arthur's knees went weak and he collapsed to the floor, his head spinning. The house was silent again, the whispers gone, the figure vanished. But the weight of what he had just experienced pressed down on him, suffocating him. He could still hear her voice ringing in his ears, demanding that he find the truth. He staggered to his feet, his mind racing. What did it mean? What had Sarah Moore been trying to tell him? Was it the killer's identity? Was it something about the house, about the curse that seemed to hang over it? His heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in his life, he questioned everything he had ever known about reality. That night, unable to sleep, Arthur spent hours poring over the details of the Moore family's murders. He read the autopsy reports again, studied the police sketches, revisited every scrap of evidence he had on the case. But as dawn broke over the house, a terrifying thought crept into his mind. The truth might not lie in what was known, but in what had been hidden. The next few days were a blur. Arthur's obsession with the case grew, pushing aside all other plans for the house. He interviewed more locals, sifted through old police records, and even consulted psychic mediums in hopes of uncovering something new. Every clue, every lead seemed to take him closer to a horrific conclusion that he wasn't ready to accept. And then one afternoon, a breakthrough came. In an old box of forgotten documents, Arthur found a letter that had been overlooked for decades. It was a letter written by a former resident of Villisca, one who had witnessed the events leading up to the murders. The letter contained a chilling account of a man who had been seen lurking around the Moore household in the days before the murders. This man was someone no one had ever suspected, someone whose name had been buried in the shadows of history. Arthur knew then that he was on the edge of something far greater than he had anticipated. The house, the spirits, the whispers, they had all been trying to guide him to this very moment, to the truth. And now, with a sinking feeling in his gut, Arthur realized that the past was never truly gone. The spirits had been right. The truth had been hidden all along, waiting for someone to uncover it, to finally give the Moore family the justice they had been denied for so long. But the truth, it seemed, would come at a price. And in the darkness of the Villisca Axe murder house, Arthur could feel the weight of that price bearing down on him. As Arthur sifted through the documents, the weight of what he had uncovered pressed heavily on his chest. His hands trembled as he held the letter, its ink faded with time, but the words were unmistakably clear. It spoke of a man who had been seen near the Moore family home in the days leading up to the murders, a man who had never been named in any official records or police reports. The letter described a stranger with wild eyes and an unsettling demeanor, a man who had been lurking around the town, whispering to locals about his unfinished business. Arthur's mind raced. Could this be the key to unlocking the mystery? The police had never connected this man to the crime, but this letter suggested otherwise. It hinted at a connection, a clue that had remained hidden for over 30 years. Could this be the elusive killer, someone so close to the Moore family that no one had suspected him? He decided to dig deeper. The next morning, he visited the town's historical society, hoping to find more information about this mysterious figure. He spent hours combing through old records and speaking with locals who might have remembered something from their youth, anything that could provide more details. It was there in the dusty archives of the society that he stumbled upon a name. The name was buried in the town's old census records. It belonged to a man named William Bill Montgomery, a transient who had come through Villisca in the early 1900s. He had stayed for several weeks in the town, claiming to be looking for work. But the townspeople who remembered him spoke of his odd behavior, how he would walk around town, muttering to himself, staring at the Moore house from across the street. No one had ever thought much of it at the time, dismissing him as just another drifter. But the letter described someone more sinister. The wild eyes, the unsettling presence. It was clear that Montgomery had been more than just a passing stranger. Arthur could feel his heart pounding as he connected the dots. Montgomery had been in the town at the right time, had been near the Moore family home when the murders occurred. The pieces were falling into place. Arthur returned to the house that evening, determined to find out more. He didn't want to involve the authorities yet, not until he had proof. He needed to confirm that Montgomery had been the killer before he could take the next step. But as he stood in front of the house once more, the familiar unease settled over him. The house, the air, the whispers, everything was exactly as it had been that night. It was then that Arthur felt it. A sudden shift in the atmosphere, a tension so thick that it felt like the very walls of the house were closing in on him. He stepped inside the door, creaking on its hinges as he entered. The house was empty, its silence almost suffocating. The temperature had dropped again, the chill in the air a stark reminder that he was never truly alone here. He made his way upstairs, the soft scrape of his shoes on the floor, the only sound in the house. His flashlight flickered as he reached the room where the Moore family had met their tragic end. It was as if the house were holding its breath, waiting for him to uncover the truth. But as he stepped into the room, something changed. The shadows seemed deeper, the room darker. The weight of the past was more pressing now, more suffocating. Arthur's flashlight flickered once more, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. And then, as he turned toward the bed where the children had once slept, he saw it. The figure, it was Montgomery. At least it looked like him. His face was pale drawn and twisted in pain, his eyes wild and unblinking. The figure stood in the corner of the room, staring directly at Arthur. His hand twitched, and for a brief moment Arthur thought he saw the glint of an axe. Just a flash, a momentary vision of the horror that had unfolded here. But it was gone in an instant, and the figure faded like a ghost, disappearing into the air. Arthur gasped, his heart racing in his chest. He stumbled back, his mind reeling. This wasn't just a figment of his imagination. The figure, the presence, it was real. And it was trying to tell him something. But what? Was it Montgomery's spirit? Or was it something else? Something darker. The room grew colder. The whispers returned louder now, almost frantic. "Justice," they murmured. "Help us." Arthur shook his head, trying to clear the fog that had clouded his thoughts. He couldn't stay here. Not now. He needed to process everything to figure out what was real and what wasn't. But as he turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind him. The air grew thick again, and for a moment, he thought he saw the figure once more standing in the doorway. Arthur's breath hitched. The house wasn't just haunted by the past. It was alive with it. The spirit of Montgomery, the victims, the killer, they were all trapped within these walls. Their unfinished business, a part of the very foundation of the house. The whispers, now louder than ever, grew desperate. "Find us. Find him." Arthur didn't know if he could uncover the full truth, or if he even wanted to. The house had a power over him, one that he couldn't explain. It was as if the house itself was pulling him in, demanding that he finish what had been started so many years ago. He left the house that night, but the feeling didn't leave him. The weight of the past clung to him, a dark shadow that would never fade. No matter how many answers he uncovered, he knew that he would never truly be free of the house. The truth of the Villisca axe murders was far more complex than he had ever imagined, and as much as he wanted to bring closure to the story, he knew that the house would never let go. And so the mystery remained unsolved, the spirits of the Moore family still trapped within its walls, whispering their desperate plea for justice to anyone who would listen. The house still stands, as it always has, waiting for the next soul, brave enough or foolish enough to uncover its dark secrets. Arthur could feel the pull of the house long after he had left it that night. The whispers, the chilling presence, the lingering figure of Montgomery. It all haunted him in his every waking moment. For weeks, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house had become a part of him, that its truth had burrowed itself deep within his soul. He was no longer simply a historian or investigator. He had become intertwined with the darkness of Villisca, bound to its unresolved past. Despite the overwhelming fear, Arthur couldn't bring himself to abandon the case. The truth, whatever it might be, still eluded him, and the voices of the spirits, the cries of Sarah Moore and her family, still echoed in his ears, urging him to find the final piece of the puzzle. He knew that his investigation wasn't just for his own closure. It was for them, for the spirits who would never be at rest until their story was told. On a rainy evening in early winter, Arthur returned to Villisca. He had spent the past few weeks compiling all of his findings, trying to make sense of the strange occurrences, the ghostly apparitions, and the terrifying whispers. He had come to one undeniable conclusion: William Montgomery was the key. The connection he had to the Moore family and to the house itself was undeniable. But there was more to the story. Arthur could feel it in his bones. The truth was buried deeper, hidden in the fabric of the town's history. This time, however, Arthur wasn't alone. He had reached out to a local paranormal research group, a team of psychics and investigators who had worked on other cases in the area. They had agreed to accompany him, hoping to document the haunting presence of the house and perhaps unlock the final chapter of its dark history. As Arthur stepped onto the porch once again, the air felt heavier, thicker than it ever had before. The house loomed in the distance, its broken windows staring back at him like empty eyes. "Are you sure about this?" one of the investigators, a woman named Clara, asked as she adjusted her equipment. Arthur nodded, his face pale but resolute. "We're going to uncover the truth tonight. All of it." With that, the group entered the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, their footsteps echoing across the dusty floorboards. The house felt different this time, more oppressive, more alive with energy, as if the walls themselves were waiting for them, listening to their every move. They made their way to the staircase just as Arthur had done so many times before. The familiar chill in the air wrapped itself around them, and the whispers began again, soft and distant, barely audible. The temperature dropped with each step they took, the cold gnawing at their skin, seeping into their bones. When they reached the second floor, the house seemed to grow even colder, the whispers now unmistakable. They were clearer, more insistent, filling the air like a dense fog. "Help us!" A voice echoed, its tone thick with desperation. It was Sarah Moore's voice, but this time it didn't just fill the air. It vibrated within their bodies, an electric pulse that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Arthur turned to Clara, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's coming from here, from the room where it happened." The group moved toward the room, their steps slow and deliberate, as if the house itself was resisting their intrusion. When they reached the door, Arthur hesitated, a wave of nausea sweeping over him. He felt the familiar pressure against his chest, the weight of the house bearing down on him, as though it were trying to stop them from entering. "Are you ready?" Clara asked, her eyes wide, fear creeping into her voice. Arthur nodded, pushing the door open. The room was bathed in an unnatural dim light, the air thick with the scent of decay. The bed where the Moore children had once slept stood now covered in dust, untouched by time. The room seemed frozen in place, caught between the past and the present. And yet the energy in the room felt alive, charged with an electricity that hummed in the air, palpable and intense. Suddenly the temperature dropped even further, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Justice. Please." The group froze. The figure appeared in the corner of the room just as it had before, but this time it was clearer, more solid. It was Sarah Moore, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth moving, but no sound coming from her. She reached out to Arthur, her hand trembling as though urging him to understand something. The anguish in her eyes was palpable, her entire being pleading for justice. The psychic Clara stepped forward, her voice trembling. "She's trying to communicate. She wants us to know something. Something important." Arthur's heart raced as he stepped closer to the apparition. The air around them crackled with energy, the room seeming to pulse with the intensity of the spirit's presence. And then a voice, a deep guttural voice, interrupted the whispers. "He's still here." Arthur's blood ran cold. He turned to the group, his voice shaking. Who said that?" Clara's eyes widened in horror. "It's him, the killer. He's still here, tied to this place. He never left." The figure of Sarah Moore began to flicker, her form fading in and out of existence as she reached out toward the door, her eyes pleading. And in that moment, Arthur understood. William Montgomery wasn't just the killer, he was still haunting this place, his spirit intertwined with the very fabric of the house. The injustice that had been done, the lives taken so brutally, had left a stain on the house, an energy that refused to leave. The whispers intensified, echoing through the room, filling the house. The figure of Sarah Moore slowly faded, her hand outstretched, as though she were trying to escape. Arthur's mind raced. The truth was clearer than ever before. Montgomery had never truly left. His spirit had become one with the house, bound by his own guilt and the horrors he had caused. But even more chilling was the realization that the house itself, its very foundation, had become a prison for the spirits of the Moore family, unable to find peace, unable to move on. The team quickly gathered their equipment and fled the house, the door slamming shut behind them as they left. As they stood outside, the wind howled around them, and Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching, still waiting. They never returned. Arthur wrote the final chapter of his investigation, but it was not what he had expected. The truth had been more than a story. It had been a curse. The Villisca Axe murder house, once a quiet home, was now a place of legend, its spirits forever bound to the walls, their cries echoing through time. The truth, it seemed, would never fully be uncovered, for the house itself held the answers, but it was unwilling to let go. And as Arthur left Villisca for good, he knew that the house would continue to stand its whispers, beckoning the next curious soul who dared to uncover its secrets. Arthur never truly left Villisca, not in the way he had hoped. The case, the house, the spirits. It was as if they had followed him, burrowing into his mind and soul, an itch he could never scratch. The truth, or what little he had pieced together, hung like a dark cloud above him. He tried to move on, to escape the memories of Sarah Moore's ghostly figure reaching for him. But every moment of his life felt tethered to that house. The house, it seemed, had become more than just a building to him. It had become an obsession, something that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, pulling him back, urging him to return. But no matter how much he tried to forget, no matter how much time passed, the whispers continued to echo in his ears. Justice. Please. They would whisper in the dead of night, just when he thought he was free. Years later, in 2045, Arthur found himself back in Villisca, this time with a singular purpose to finally close the door on the past. He couldn't live like this anymore. The house was still there, its decaying silhouette perched on the edge of town, waiting for him to come back and finish what had been started. The town had changed, of course. New families, new faces, new stories. But the house remained a constant, a reminder of something that could never be fully understood. Arthur stood in front of the house once more, the familiar sense of dread washing over him. The wind had picked up, rustling the bare branches of the trees, and the air felt thick, heavy with the weight of the past. The house was quiet, as it always was, but there was something about it now, something different. It seemed to be watching him, waiting. He walked slowly up the creaky porch steps, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the door. This time, he didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, the familiar scent of dust and decay hitting him like a punch in the gut. The house felt alive, as if it had been waiting for him all these years. Arthur made his way upstairs, each step creaking beneath his weight. The air was colder than it had ever been before. As he approached the room where the Moore family had been slaughtered, the temperature seemed to drop even further. His breath fogged in front of him, the chill wrapping itself around his heart. When he reached the doorway, he paused. He could hear it again, the faint whispers, the low murmur of voices. Help us. Please. Arthur stepped inside the room, his eyes scanning the familiar space. The bed was still there, covered in dust, but the room felt different now. It wasn't just a room. It was a vessel, a container for all the sorrow, all the pain that had been trapped here for over 3 decades. And then he saw it. The figure appeared as it had so many times before. But this time, there was no mistaking it. This wasn't just Sarah Moore's ghost. This was the entire family, her husband Josiah, their 4 children, and Sarah herself, standing together, their faces filled with the same terror they had worn in their final moments. Their eyes were wide, their bodies frozen in time. And as they stared at Arthur, the room grew colder still, the temperature plummeting to a level that felt unnatural. Arthur's heart raced as he stepped forward. The spirits didn't speak this time. Instead, they seemed to communicate with him through their eyes, their pain, their frustration, their unfulfilled need for justice. It was as if they were begging him to do what he had failed to do years ago, to finish the story, to uncover the truth that had been buried for so long. The room seemed to pulse with energy, as if the house itself were alive, the very walls vibrating with the energy of the spirits trapped inside. And then just as quickly as they had appeared, the figures vanished, leaving only the echo of their presence behind. Arthur stood there shaken to his core, his breath ragged as he tried to process what had just happened. But he knew. He understood now. The spirits of the Moore family were not just looking for revenge. They were looking for closure, for someone to remember them, for their story to finally be told. The truth wasn't just about uncovering the identity of the killer. It was about telling the world what had happened here, about making sure that their deaths were never forgotten. Arthur left the house that night, but this time he didn't feel the same pull, the same gnawing sensation. The house had given him what he needed, the understanding, the clarity. The story of the Villisca Axe murders would finally be complete. He would make sure of it. Over the next few months, Arthur worked tirelessly. He pored over every piece of evidence, every document, every interview, and with the help of a team of experts, he uncovered the final piece of the puzzle. William Montgomery had been the killer, and though his name had been lost to history, Arthur's research revealed the horrifying truth. Montgomery had been a local drifter, a man with a violent past who had become obsessed with the Moore family. The murder had been the result of a twisted obsession, a violent outburst of rage, and the house had become the final resting place for his guilt, his madness. The revelations were shocking, but Arthur didn't care about the recognition. He didn't care if the world ever knew his name. What mattered now was that the Moore family's story had finally been told. Their spirits could rest, their truth finally uncovered. But even as he finished his work, Arthur knew that the house would always be there, standing as a monument to the past. The whispers, the ghosts, they would never truly leave. The Villisca Axe murder house had become a part of the town's history, a place where the living and the dead were forever intertwined, where the echoes of the past would continue to haunt the present. Arthur's final words about the house were simple, but they spoke volumes. The truth is not just about the killer. It's about the souls left behind. And sometimes the most terrifying thing is not the unknown, but the truth that's been buried for far too long. As Arthur walked away from the house one last time, the wind whispered behind him, soft and mournful. And somewhere deep within the walls, he could almost hear the spirits of the Moore family finally finding their peace. In the years following the closure of the Villisca Axe murder case, Arthur's life slowly returned to normal. The documentary about the Moore family and the tragic events that unfolded in their home became a well-regarded piece in the historical and true crime communities. Arthur's name was attached to the truth. William Montgomery's identity as the killer was now public, the long-overdue justice finally delivered. But the house, the Villisca Axe murder house, was never forgotten. Though Arthur had done everything he could to bring peace to the spirits of the Moore family, something about the house still haunted him. It lingered in his mind like a dark specter that refused to leave a reminder of the ancient power that had tied those spirits to the earth, bound them to the house. Despite the resolution of the mystery, the house itself seemed to resist closure. It continued to draw in those who felt the pull of its tragic past. Tourists, ghost hunters, and curious souls alike still made pilgrimages to the infamous site. It was a place of dark history, a house where the living could confront death, or perhaps something worse. The house stood like a black monolith, its shadow stretching over Villisca like a curse that could never be undone. In 2050, almost 20 years after Arthur's final investigation, a new generation of explorers decided to test the boundaries of the house's curse. A group of ambitious filmmakers eager to create the most terrifying documentary about haunted locations secured permission to spend a full week inside the house. This was to be their magnum opus, capturing not just the haunting presence, but the very essence of what made Villisca's house so terrifying. They were prepared to provoke the spirits to capture raw, unfiltered evidence of the supernatural. And while they had read all the past accounts, they were unprepared for the horrors they would face. The group arrived on a quiet spring evening. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the house as they set up their cameras and equipment. A sense of unease crept in almost immediately. But they were professionals. They were used to the supernatural, used to the strange occurrences that came with their work. They dismissed the unease as part of the atmosphere, not realizing they were stepping into something much darker than they could comprehend. The first few hours were typical. They filmed in silence, walking through the empty rooms, setting up cameras in the corners of the house, trying to capture whatever might happen. They did everything according to plan, but as the night descended, strange things began to occur. Small items moved in front of their cameras, objects shifting as though pushed by invisible hands. The temperature dropped suddenly and sharply, but no one could explain why. And then, in the dead of night, came the whispers. "Help us!" The voice was faint at first, but it soon became unmistakable. The crew turned their attention toward the sound, setting up audio equipment to record. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, like voices pleading from the walls themselves. "Please help us." The filmmakers, eager to catch something real on camera, pushed forward. But the house had no intention of giving them answers. No, it was waiting for something more, something darker. By the time the crew reached the upstairs bedroom, they were on edge. Their cameras captured the inexplicable, a shadow crossing the room, a fleeting figure standing near the door, and the unmistakable feeling of something watching them from the corners. But when they entered the room where the Moore family had been murdered, the atmosphere changed completely. The temperature plummeted. Every step they took felt like they were being watched by something ancient, something deeply malevolent. As one of the crew members, Mark, set up a camera by the window, the others noticed something strange, a faint figure barely visible in the corner of the room. It was a woman, her form translucent, her expression filled with terror. Mark turned around just in time to see her fading into the darkness, disappearing like smoke in the wind. "Did you see that?" one of the filmmakers asked, her voice barely a whisper. But before anyone could respond, the house let out a deafening creak. The floorboards beneath them groaned as if they were about to give way. The walls seemed to shift, the air felt thick, and the whispers turned into something more, something darker. "Get out, get out, get out." The words echoed in their minds, repeating over and over like a warning that would not be ignored. Panic set in as the crew scrambled to leave the room, but the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The room went dark, utterly dark. The sound of footsteps grew louder, moving around them, but when they looked, no one was there. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing their flashlights. The temperature dropped even further, to the point where it felt like they were standing in the middle of a frozen tundra. The crew, now visibly terrified, tried to escape, but the house had no intention of letting them leave so easily. They found themselves trapped, the door stubbornly locked, and the house itself seemed to twist and bend around them. Through the darkness, one of the crew members saw something moving, a figure this time, not transparent, but solid and real. It was a man tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. It was Montgomery. His image flickered in and out like a shadow against the walls, as though he were an apparition that couldn't fully manifest, trapped between this world and the next. "Leave, now." The figure rasped, its voice like gravel. "You've seen too much." The crew, now panicked beyond reason, managed to break free from the house, running out into the cold night, leaving their equipment behind. They never spoke of what happened inside those walls, but their silence was the loudest testimony of all. The documentary they had planned was never released. The footage they had captured was left behind untouched, forgotten. As for the house, well, it remained. Standing silently, its secrets buried deep within its decaying walls. And as long as it stood, the spirits of the Moore family and the restless soul of Montgomery would continue to haunt it, forever trapped in the dark, echoing silence of the past. The truth had been uncovered, but it came at a price. The house was not just a place of murder. It was a place of eternal torment, a place where the living and the dead were forever bound. And so the whispers would never end. The years slipped by, and though the world moved on the Villisca axe, Murder House remained a scar on the land, its presence as constant as the whispers that continued to haunt those who ventured too close. The house, long since abandoned by the filmmakers and the curious tourists, stood against the test of time like a rotting monument to an unspeakable past. It was as if the house itself had become a living entity, its foundation soaked with grief and sorrow that no amount of time could wash away. Despite the horrifying events that had transpired within its walls, the town of Villisca itself carried on business as usual. But the rumors of strange occurrences never truly died. People still spoke of the house in hushed tones, mentioning it only when the night was deep enough to shield them from the consequences of speaking too loudly. Every now and then, someone would disappear in the night, vanishing without a trace, leaving only the faintest suspicion that the house had claimed another victim. But nothing was ever proven, and life, as it often does, carried on. In 2065, a young couple named Elise and Thomas moved into the old farmhouse just outside of Villisca, seeking peace and a fresh start after a series of traumatic events in their own lives. They had heard the stories. Of course, everyone in the area knew about the house. But Elise, a psychology major with an interest in the supernatural, saw it as nothing more than a local legend, a tale spun by bored townsfolk with too much time on their hands. Thomas, skeptical as ever, agreed with her, never one to indulge in things that couldn't be explained by reason. They'd heard of the house's history, but they weren't afraid, at least not at first. They were eager to build a life of their own, away from the noise of the city, and the idea of living on land so steeped in history intrigued Elise. The couple bought the land on a whim, even visiting the house to catch a glimpse of the site that had captured the imagination of so many. That first night in their new home, as they lay in bed, the wind howling outside, they spoke about their future. The wind carried an eerie chill, but the house was solid, strong, quiet, and yet somehow still. Then, just as they drifted to sleep, the whispers began. At first they thought it was the wind. The old house creaked and groaned with the change in the weather. But as the whispers grew louder, closer, Elise could feel her heart race. It wasn't the wind anymore. It was a voice. "Help us!" Elise sat up, her breath shallow, trying to identify the source. She turned to Thomas, but he was asleep beside her, unaware of the soft, mournful call coming from somewhere deep in the house. She lay back down, telling herself it was just the house settling, that it was nothing more than a figment of the imagination, the product of too many ghost stories. But it didn't stop. "Please, help us." The voice was clear now, distinct but distant, as though it came from the walls themselves. Elise's blood ran cold. She reached for Thomas, shaking him awake. "Thomas, do you hear that?" He groggily opened his eyes, disoriented. "What, hear what?" The whispering, she whispered, her voice trembling. The voices coming from the walls. Thomas turned to her now, fully awake. "You're just tired. There's nothing there. We've been through a lot. It's just your mind playing tricks." But Elise couldn't shake the feeling. She could feel the weight of the house's history pressing down on her, the energy in the room growing denser with each passing second. Something was wrong. They both tried to sleep, but the whispers only grew louder. They filled the room, echoing in every corner, calling to them. "Help us. Help us." By morning, they were both on edge. Neither of them spoke about what had happened. Elise convinced herself it had all been a dream, a trick of the mind. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the nagging sensation that something wasn't right. The house wasn't just old, it was alive, pulsing with the echoes of something far darker than they could have imagined. The days that followed were filled with unsettling occurrences. The temperature fluctuated, dropping unexpectedly, and strange sounds came from the walls at night, scratching, scraping, like something trying to get out. And always the whispering, "Help us." It seemed to come from everywhere, from the walls, the floors, the ceilings. One afternoon, Elise decided to visit the local historical society to ask about the house's history. She couldn't ignore it any longer. She needed answers. As she entered the building, she was met by an elderly woman, Mrs. Winter, who had lived in Villisca for as long as anyone could remember. When Elise mentioned the house, Mrs. Winter's expression shifted, and she leaned in closer, her voice lowering. "The house. It's not just a house," Mrs. Winter whispered. "It's a place where evil lives. The spirits of the Moore family. They're still there. The house feeds on their pain, and anyone who stays there will feel it too." Elise's heart raced. "But why haven't they left?" Mrs. Winter shook her head. "They can't. The killer, Montgomery, he never left either. He's trapped there, bound to the house by his own guilt. And the Moore family? They're caught in the middle. No one can move on until the truth is known, until justice is served." That night, the whispering grew unbearable. Elise could no longer deny the truth. The house had become a prison for the spirits trapped within it. The figure of Sarah Moore appeared in the hallway just beyond their bedroom door, her eyes wide with sorrow. She stood there silent, but her presence was undeniable, a manifestation of the unspoken pain that clung to the house. The next morning, Elise and Thomas knew what they had to do. They couldn't stay. The house had claimed them as it had claimed so many others before. They gathered their things in a hurry, but as they reached the door, a sudden force slammed it shut. They turned to look, and in the darkness of the room they saw it, the figure of a man, tall and gaunt, standing just inside the doorway. It was William Montgomery. His eyes were hollow, his face twisted with guilt and rage. He was the one who had kept them here, the one who had refused to let go his spirit bound to the house for eternity. He pointed toward the stairs, his voice rasping like a dying wind. "Leave. Leave now." Elise grabbed Thomas, her heart pounding in her chest. With shaking hands, she opened the door, and they fled into the night, leaving the house and Villisca behind. But as they drove away, Elise couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching, still waiting for someone else to come. The whispers continued to echo in her mind, filling her thoughts with one last haunting plea. "Help us, please!" The Villisca Axe murder house stood silent once again, its dark history still tangled in the walls, waiting for the next soul brave enough to uncover its secrets. And as long as it stood, the spirits of the Moore family and the killer who had destroyed their lives would remain trapped in the house, forever bound to its shadow. Years passed since Elise and Thomas had fled the Villisca Axe murder house, but the stories surrounding it never ceased. The house, once abandoned by them and countless others, had become an even darker part of the town's history. As the years wore on, the town of Villisca itself seemed to grow more distant from the house, as though it too had given up trying to understand the terrible legacy left behind. Yet the house stood watching, waiting. Its very presence seemed to whisper the old dark stories to anyone brave or foolish enough to venture close. But in 2070, something changed. The house, after years of neglect, was purchased again, this time by a man named David Winter, a descendant of Mrs. Winter, the elderly woman who had once warned Elise. David, unlike his predecessor, was not interested in preserving the house as a museum or tourist attraction. His intentions were different. He had heard the stories from his family for years, and like so many others before him, he believed there was something deeper buried within the house, something that had yet to be uncovered. He was determined to find it. David Winter was not afraid of the house. He had heard the whispers just like the others, but he refused to believe in ghosts or supernatural forces. He was a man of reason, a historian, and he approached the house with the mindset of solving a riddle, one that had eluded everyone who had come before him. The truth, he thought, was simple. It had to be. It was just a matter of digging deep enough, finding the right connections, the right pieces of evidence. The first night he spent in the house was uneventful, at least by his standards. He had spent the day going through old records trying to track down any relevant information about the Moore family and the house's history. He read through countless articles, police reports, and testimonies from townspeople who had lived through the murders. Everything seemed to point to the same conclusion: the killer was William Montgomery, a drifter who had spent some time in Villisca before the murders. But there were still many unanswered questions, details that didn't quite fit. As the night fell and the house grew colder, David sat in the room where the Moore family had been murdered, the room where so much pain and suffering had occurred. The air felt thick, like it was waiting for something, for someone. He glanced at the photographs of the family on the walls, their faces smiling, frozen in happier times. For a moment, he almost felt a twinge of regret for disturbing their history, but he shook it off. He wasn't here to cause more pain. He was here to find the truth. The air grew colder still. David had read that the temperature often dropped in the house, but this was different. It wasn't just the chill of an old, abandoned house. It was a presence, one that seemed to move with him, following him as he explored. The lights flickered, and for the briefest of moments, the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally. But it wasn't until he heard the first whisper that David began to question his skepticism. "Help us." The voice was faint, barely audible, but David froze. His breath hitched in his chest as he turned toward the sound. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Help us." David's pulse quickened. He glanced around the room, but there was no one there, just the stillness of the abandoned house. His mind raced. Was it the wind? Had he imagined it? No. It was too clear, too distinct. His hand reached for the recorder he had set up earlier, the device he had been using to track any unusual sounds. He pressed play. The recording was silent, empty. No whispers, no sounds at all. His throat tightened, but he dismissed it. It was just the house settling. It had to be. He was simply letting the legends get to him, just like so many before him. But when he turned to leave the room, the whispers started again, this time louder. "Please, help us." David's heart raced. The voice came from all around him, filling the room with an intensity that left him breathless. The walls seemed to close in as the temperature dropped further. He rushed to the door, but the moment his hand touched the handle, it slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire frame. "Justice!" The voice called now, no longer a whisper, but a deep guttural plea. "Find us. Find the truth." David backed away from the door, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The air was electric, charged with something he couldn't quite grasp. He could feel the weight of the house pressing down on him, the weight of its tragic history, its dark past. He reached into his jacket pocket for his phone, ready to call for help, but as he pulled it out, it slipped from his fingers, crashing to the floor and cracking the screen. And then, as if on cue, the figure appeared. It was Sarah Moore, standing at the far end of the room, her eyes wide with terror. Her clothes were stained with blood, her face twisted in anguish. She reached out to him, her fingers trembling as if trying to convey something. David couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his entire body frozen in fear as he stared into her eyes. "Please," the spirit whispered, her voice faint but clear. "Help us. Please. Set us free." Her form flickered in and out of existence, growing fainter with every passing second. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, Sarah Moore vanished, her presence evaporating into the cold, dark air. David stumbled back, his hand shaking. He couldn't breathe. This wasn't real, this couldn't be real. But deep down, he knew it was. The house was alive with the spirits of the Moore family and with the malevolent presence of William Montgomery. The house had never truly let them go, and it was clear that no one would find peace until the truth had been told. Desperate for answers, David threw himself back into his research. But every piece of evidence he uncovered seemed to only deepen the mystery. He discovered an old journal that had belonged to the town sheriff, a man who had once investigated the case. In the journal, there was a notation about a mysterious man who had been seen around the house in the days before the murders. A man whose description matched Montgomery, but whose connection to the Moore family was never fully understood. The journal suggested that Montgomery may have been more than just a drifter, more than just a transient. There were hints buried deep in the pages that he had known the Moore family in some capacity, perhaps as a neighbor, or even something darker. David felt a chill run down his spine as the truth began to unravel before him. He knew what he had to do. With one final decisive move, David made contact with the town's oldest living resident, someone who had been a child during the murders and who had survived the horror. He needed to know everything. He had to uncover the truth once and for all. But as the day of his meeting approached, David could feel the house growing more restless, as though it knew the truth was about to be revealed. And deep in his heart, he knew that whatever answer he uncovered, it would come at a great cost. The Villisca Axe murder house had waited a long time for justice, and now it was ready to reveal everything. The day of David's meeting with the elderly resident of Villisca, a man named Clarence Wells, dawned cold and foggy, as if the weather itself were foretelling the gravity of what was about to unfold. David had spent the night in the Villisca house, his resolve solidified the weight of the spirit's whispers, pressing harder against him with every passing hour. He had already begun to understand that the truth wasn't just a matter of facts and evidence. It was something far darker, something rooted deep within the land itself, entwined with the house's very foundation. Clarence Wells had been a child when the Moore family was murdered. He remembered the night vividly, though his memories were hazy, like a fog that would never quite lift. He had been part of the search efforts, part of the initial investigation. and had seen things that others had only heard about. What Clarence had seen, what he had lived through, was part of the story that had never made it into the official reports, part of the truth that had been buried by time. David's car crept through the misty streets of Villisca, and as he neared Clarence's house, an oppressive feeling settled over him. The town had changed little over the years, but as he passed the familiar landmarks, he couldn't help but feel that the shadows were deeper now. The house, the one he had worked in so tirelessly, the one that had been the site of so much horror, loomed large in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was finally within reach, but that it would exact a price that he might not be ready to pay. Clarence's home was modest, tucked away on the edge of town. David knocked at the door, his heart racing in anticipation. An elderly man opened it, his face etched with time's passage, his eyes clouded by years of grief and regret. David Winter Wright. Clarence's voice was raspy but kind. "Come in. I've been waiting for you." David stepped inside, and as the door closed behind him, he felt the temperature drop, the familiar chill that had followed him from the house, clinging to his skin. It was as though the past had never really gone away, that it still lingered here, just on the edge of their reality. Clarence led him to a small living room where an old armchair sat by the fireplace. The man motioned for David to sit. "I'm glad you came," Clarence said, settling into his own chair across from David. His eyes flickered for a moment, as if he were remembering something long buried. "I've been meaning to talk to someone about all of this for years, but no one has ever asked the right questions." David took a deep breath, his voice steady, but with a hint of urgency. "I've been investigating the house, the Moore family, the murders, and I think I found something that ties everything together. But there's still a piece I don't understand." Clarence's eyes seemed to sharpen, as if a hidden fire was reigniting within him. He leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "What piece?" David hesitated, his mind racing over everything he had uncovered, the evidence, the spirits, the house itself, the connection between William Montgomery and the Moore family. How did he know them? Why did he target them? Clarence's face darkened, and for a moment, the air in the room felt thick, heavy with a truth long buried. The old man's hands shook slightly as he clasped them together, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "Montgomery didn't just know the Moore family," Clarence said slowly. "He was one of them, or at least he thought he was." David's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Clarence closed his eyes, and for a long moment the room was silent. Then he spoke again, his voice thick with sorrow. "William Montgomery wasn't just a drifter. He wasn't just passing through Villisca. He had spent time with the Moore family before the murders. He had a twisted attachment to Sarah Moore. They weren't just acquaintances. He believed she was his wife." David's blood ran cold. "You're saying Montgomery was obsessed with her?" Clarence nodded gravely. "Yes, more than obsessed. He had a history of mental instability. He came to Villisca looking for a new life, but when he met Sarah, something in his mind snapped. He believed that she had been waiting for him, that she was meant to be with him. He wasn't a stranger to them. In fact, Sarah's husband Josiah had tried to help him when he first arrived in town, but Montgomery was already too far gone. The obsession turned into rage in the house. The house was his way of making Sarah his no matter the cost. David sat in stunned silence, absorbing what Clarence had just revealed. It was a revelation that sent chills through his spine. The story wasn't just about an outsider committing a random act of violence. It was about obsession, mental illness, and a twisted sense of ownership that had led to a massacre. The Moore family had been caught in the crossfire of Montgomery's delusions, his violent outbursts fueled by a fantasy that had driven him to commit unspeakable acts. But there was more. Clarence leaned in closer, his voice lowering even further, as if the very walls were listening. "There's one more thing, David. Something you might not have heard." Montgomery didn't act alone. He wasn't the only one who was trapped in that house. David's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, who else was there?" Clarence's eyes flickered to the old photographs of the Moore family on the wall, his voice growing tight. Josiah Moore, Sarah's husband. He was trying to protect his family, trying to keep Montgomery at bay, but when he saw what had happened to Sarah, when he realized she was lost to him, he was complicit in the death of his own family. David stared at him, disbelief flooding his chest. "You're saying Josiah, Clarence nodded slowly. "He helped Montgomery. Maybe not directly, but he was consumed with his own guilt. He knew Sarah was slipping away from him, knew she was lost to someone else, and he couldn't live with it. So when Montgomery decided to act on his obsession, Josiah did nothing to stop him. He let it happen. And that made him just as responsible." David's mind reeled. The truth was far darker than he had ever imagined. Not only had Montgomery been the catalyst for the murders, but Josiah's own role, his unspoken complicity, added another layer to the tragedy. The Moore family was doomed not just by the murderer, but by their own fractured minds, their broken relationships, and the twisted psychological hold that the house had on them. David exhaled sharply. "So what happens now? What can we do?" Clarence stared at the wall, his face lost in thought. "The house still holds them. The spirits are trapped just as Montgomery is. The only way for them to be free is for someone to acknowledge their suffering, to bring their story to light, and for the guilt to be fully understood." David knew what he had to do. He had already exposed the facts. He had already uncovered the killer's identity. But now he understood the story was never just about the murders. It was about the human cost, the psychological destruction that had torn this family apart before Montgomery even raised his axe. The house, the spirits, the endless whispers, they were all tied to the emotional wreckage left behind. Only by acknowledging the full depth of that pain, by truly understanding it, could the cycle finally be broken. That night, as David stood outside the Villisca axe murder house, the weight of the past felt heavier than ever. The truth had been uncovered, but the house still had one last story to tell. The whispers began again, low and desperate, but this time David understood, and in that moment, he knew that the house would never truly be at peace until the broken pieces of the past were finally put back together. David Winter stood at the threshold of the Villisca axe murder house, the night stretching before him like an abyss. The cold, damp air clung to his skin, as if the house itself were reaching out, waiting for him to return. He had uncovered the layers of the truth, the pieces of the puzzle that had eluded so many before him. But he knew now that understanding the past was not enough. The house, the spirits of the Moore family, and the darkness that clung to the very walls were still unresolved. They still demanded something more. For years, the house had fed on the guilt, the trauma, the broken relationships. It had become a prison, not just for the spirits of Sarah Moore and her family, but for the town of Villisca itself. The air felt thick, as if the house was waiting for David to finally close the door on its tortured history. But he knew the price of that closure would be steep. He had to go deeper. Deeper into the house, deeper into the pain that had built its walls. The town had moved on, but he hadn't. He had come to understand something more profound than just the tragedy of that night. The Villisca house wasn't merely a haunted building. It was a scar on the land, a place where the past had bled into the present, trapping everyone who dared to uncover its secrets in a cycle of torment. The house had been forgotten, abandoned, and in doing so, its true power had been allowed to grow. David didn't know if he could bring the kind of closure the house needed, but he was sure of one thing: he couldn't let it remain as it was. Not anymore. As he entered the house again, this time with no cameras, no teams of experts, he walked alone, guided only by the whispers that seemed to follow him, growing louder the closer he came to the center of the house. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy he could feel in his bones. The temperature dropped as he ascended the staircase toward the room where it had all happened. The room was silent when he stepped inside, but it was the silence of something waiting, holding its breath. The air was thick, laden with centuries of grief and despair, and David could almost feel the weight of the spirits pressing down on him. The bed where the Moore children had slept was covered in dust. The furniture once filled with life was now just empty shells of what had been. But the space felt different now, as if the house itself was watching him, anticipating his every movement. He stood in the center of the room and closed his eyes, breathing in the cold, stagnant air. His thoughts raced as he tried to process the enormity of what had happened here. The murders had been horrific, yes, but the true tragedy wasn't just the blood spilled. It was the psychological destruction that led to it. The obsessions, the guilt, the betrayals they had all built up to this moment. The house had absorbed it all, holding on to the broken pieces like a sponge. Sarah. David whispered, his voice barely audible in the thick silence. "I'm here. I understand." For a long moment, nothing happened. The room stayed still, as though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. Then he heard it. A soft, faint sound, like a sigh. He turned, and there, in the corner of the room, appeared Sarah Moore. Her face was pale, her features twisted in sorrow and fear, but there was something different about her this time. Her eyes weren't pleading with him for justice. They were waiting for him to understand. "Please." Her voice was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "Help us. Help him." David's heart skipped a beat. He stepped forward, drawn to her, but as he did, the room seemed to pulse, the walls closing in on him. He wasn't just facing Sarah now. He was facing the house itself, facing the combined energy of all the pain, the confusion and the guilt that had accumulated within its walls over the years. He could feel it, felt it rise up like a tidal wave, pushing against him, suffocating him. The whispers, now louder, turned into a chorus of voices, all crying out in unison. "Help us. Please. Set us free." David understood then. The spirits of the Moore family were not just asking for justice for their deaths. They were asking for the truth to be acknowledged in its entirety. Not just the murder, not just Montgomery's role, but everything. The house was a reflection of their brokenness, a symbol of the fractured lives that had been destroyed by guilt obsession, and the darkness that had taken root long before the axe had been raised. In that moment, David knew what he had to do. He had to acknowledge everything. He had to speak the truth, all of it. I know, he whispered, his voice trembling as he spoke. "I understand now. It wasn't just the killer. It was all of you. The pain, the guilt. It's all part of this house." The temperature in the room dropped sharply. The air felt heavy, almost unbearable. The walls seemed to groan in response to his words, as if the house was releasing its breath for the first time in decades. "I acknowledge the truth." David continued, his voice steady, though his body trembled. "The truth of your suffering. The truth of your lives, of the brokenness that led to this. And I will tell your story. All of it. I will make sure the world knows the truth of what happened here. As soon as the words left his mouth, the room seemed to change. The temperature began to rise, the oppressive weight lifting like a cloud, finally breaking apart. Sarah's form flickered, her face softening, as if the anguish that had marked her presence was starting to fade. She reached out to him, her hand shaking, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. David felt a sharp pang in his chest as he understood what was happening. The House's spirits were finally being acknowledged for the first time in history. The truth buried for so long had been spoken aloud. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed open, and the shadows in the corner of the room shifted. Montgomery appeared, his form flickering like a dying flame. His face twisted in anger and pain, but he said nothing. He simply stared at David as if acknowledging the fact that the truth was finally being told, that he too had been recognized. "You are bound here," David said, his voice steady now. "Your guilt, your obsession, they've kept you here, kept all of you here. But now it's time for the truth to set you free. All of you." Montgomery's figure faded, his presence growing weaker with every passing second. The last remnants of the House's dark energy seemed to dissipate, and the oppressive weight lifted entirely, leaving behind a strange, peaceful silence. David took a deep breath, his heart still racing, his body exhausted by the emotional toll of what had just happened. He could feel it. The house was lighter, the air clearer, as though something had been released from its walls. Sarah Moore appeared one last time, her face serene now, her features soft and peaceful. She reached out to him, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder, before she faded, her presence finally at peace. The whispers were gone. The house, though still standing, felt different, empty, but not in the way it had been before. It was as if the souls trapped within its walls had been set free. Their torment finally ended. David stood in the center of the room for a long time, letting the silence wash over him. The truth had been spoken, and the house had let go of its painful grip. He had done what he came to do. As he left the room, he looked back at the house one last time, knowing it would never haunt him again. The ghosts of the Moore family and William Montgomery were gone, their story finally told. And with that, the house would finally be allowed to rest. David walked out into the quiet night, leaving Villisca and its cursed house behind. Years passed after David Winter left the Villisca Axe murder house, but the weight of his final visit lingered in the quiet streets of Villisca, a town that would never truly escape the shadows of its past. The house, which had once been a symbol of tragedy, became an oddity of history, with whispers of its haunting fading into the background. People still spoke of the house, but they no longer feared it. The truth had been spoken. The spirits had found peace. The once feared house no longer seemed to loom as it once had. Yet despite the sense of closure David believed he had brought, the town would always carry the scars of its history. The house may have been free from the chains of torment that had held it for decades, but the energy, the trauma, was never completely erased. Though the house had become a place of quiet, almost sacred reflection, it would never be entirely free from the weight it had carried for so long. In the years that followed, new families moved into Villisca, unaware of the horrors that had occurred so many decades ago. Children played in the streets, couples built homes, and businesses grew. The town seemed to continue, as though the house on 2nd Street had never been more than a distant memory, a piece of folklore, a curiosity for those passing through. But some things, some places carry the weight of their pasts no matter how much time passes. And though the house had been freed from the grip of its haunting, the knowledge of what had happened there was never truly gone. As with all tragedies, It had become a part of Villisca's fabric, woven into the identity of the town in a way that would never be undone. In 2080, the house was purchased once again, but this time, the new owners, a young couple named Richard and Eliza, were determined to restore it. They were passionate about preserving history, and the house seemed like a challenge they were eager to embrace. They'd heard the stories, of course, but like so many before them, they had no fear. It was just a house, old, run down, full of history. They believed they could breathe new life into it, turning it into a place of learning, a site where people could come to understand the tragedy that had unfolded there. Eliza, with her background in history, was fascinated by the past, and she often found herself researching the Moore family and the details of the murders. She was captivated by the old photographs of the family, the police reports, and the scattered articles that spoke of a mystery that had never been fully solved. The more she learned, the more she wanted to know. She started talking to the townsfolk, seeking out old interviews and stories. And slowly, her fascination deepened into an obsession. One rainy afternoon, as the couple worked inside restoring the house's foundation, Eliza stumbled upon something strange in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of the master bedroom. It was a box, old and worn with age, covered in dust and grime. Inside the box were papers, letters, a journal, and photographs that had never been seen before. The items were carefully preserved, but the contents were chilling. Eliza sifted through the papers, her hands trembling as she unfolded an old yellowed letter written in careful handwriting. It was addressed to Sarah Moore. The letter was from a man, William Montgomery. It wasn't just a letter of obsession or love. It was a confession. In it, Montgomery wrote about his twisted connection to Sarah, his belief that she had been meant for him, that they had been destined to be together. He spoke of his jealousy of Josiah, of his growing obsession with Sarah, and how he had planned the murders. But what struck Eliza most was the last line of the letter, a phrase that made her blood run cold. "I will make them all see that you are mine. And when I am finished, they will never take you from me again." Eliza's heart pounded as she read the words over and over. It wasn't just a crime of passion, it was something deeper. Something that could not be explained by mere jealousy or anger. Montgomery had believed with all his mind that he had been justified in his actions. And in that belief, he had killed an entire family, trapping their spirits in the house forever. She immediately shared the discovery with Richard, but even he could see how profoundly disturbing the letter was. This wasn't just a relic from the past, it was a piece of the puzzle that David Winter had never fully understood. Montgomery had left behind a trail of madness that had never been fully acknowledged, even with all the truth that had been uncovered. As they continued to restore the house, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air grew heavier with each passing day. The whispers, the ones David had heard so long ago, began to return, faint at first, then louder, as if the house itself was aware of the new presence within its walls. The house seemed to breathe again, its energy shifting its past, pulling Richard and Eliza into its depths. At night, when the house was quiet, Eliza could hear the soft footsteps echoing down the halls, the creaking of the stairs, the sound of someone moving in the rooms above. But when she went to check, there was never anyone there. Richard, too, began to feel it, the constant pressure, the sense that the house was alive, watching them, waiting for something. He started to see things, fleeting figures in the corner of his eye shadows that moved against the grain of the house's decaying walls. At times, he swore he saw Sarah Moore standing in the doorway, her eyes filled with sorrow, her hand reaching out to him. But when he looked again, she was gone. And then one night it happened. Eliza was alone in the house finishing some paperwork when she heard it, the softest whisper so close that she could feel it in her bones. "Help us, please." Her heart raced as she stood frozen in place. The house was dark, the air thick with tension. She turned slowly, her gaze falling upon the staircase. And then, just as the whisper had started, the figure appeared Sarah Moore. Her pale face twisted in pain, her eyes locked on Eliza. The spirit moved toward her, her mouth opening to speak, but no sound came from her lips. Eliza stepped backward, fear overtaking her. She turned to run, but as she did, the house seemed to shift. The walls seemed to close in the air, thickening with the weight of years of agony. Eliza's vision blurred as she stumbled down the hallway toward the front door. She couldn't get out. The door wouldn't open. The house was trapping her. "Help us!" The voice whispered again, louder, more desperate. "Find the truth. End the cycle." And in that moment, Eliza realized that the house, the spirits, the evil that had been trapped here for so long, none of it could ever truly be free until the entire story was known. Not just the murders, not just the killer, but the emotional, psychological destruction that had set everything into motion. William Montgomery's madness, Sarah Moore's sorrow, Josiah's guilt. They were all part of the same unbroken chain. The truth had to be told. And only then would the house, its spirits, and the darkness that had clung to it for so long, finally be at peace. As Eliza stood frozen in the hallway, her heart pounding, her mind racing, the atmosphere around her seemed to shift again. The house groaned a deep, mournful sound, as if it were reacting to her realization. The air was thick, suffocating. It felt as though the walls themselves were watching her, waiting for her to acknowledge the truth that had been buried for so long. The figure of Sarah Moore lingered in the doorway, her form flickering and fading like a dying candle. Eliza's breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to comprehend what was happening. She knew she couldn't run. She couldn't escape the house, not until she understood its truth, not until she understood why Sarah Moore and all those who had suffered here were still trapped within its walls. Find the truth. End the cycle. The voice echoed the whisper, now a low, desperate cry seeping into her very soul. Eliza felt a strange pull, an overwhelming sense of urgency that filled her from head to toe. It was as though the house itself was guiding her, urging her to step deeper into the web of the past. With shaking hands, she reached for the door, the same door that had once sealed in all the pain, all the suffering. The door opened, and Eliza found herself standing in the room where it had all begun, the room where the Moore family had met their untimely end. The bed was still there, untouched, the floorboards worn with age. But now, in the dim light, the room felt different. The air seemed thick with sorrow, the walls heavy with untold secrets. As she stepped inside, Eliza's breath caught in her throat. The figure of Sarah Moore appeared again, standing in the corner, her eyes pleading. This time, there was no fear in Sarah's eyes. Instead, there was a deep sadness, a mourning for the lives lost, the truth that had been buried for so long. Eliza stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Sarah, what do you want me to do?" Sarah's form flickered, and the room grew colder. But this time, there was no hostility, no anger. There was only grief, deep and all-encompassing. Eliza could feel the weight of the spirits trapped within this house, the weight of their suffering. "Speak the truth." Sarah's voice echoed a soft plea that carried on the wind. "Set us free." Eliza's mind raced. The whispers, the figure of Sarah, the history that had plagued this house, they were all tied to the same thread. William Montgomery had not just been a murderer. He had been consumed by an obsession, a madness that had twisted the lives of everyone involved. Sarah's love for her family, her desire to protect them, had been the very thing that had caused her downfall. But it wasn't just the tragedy of their deaths that had kept the spirits trapped here. It was the unspoken truth, the guilt and the broken bonds that had held them prisoner in the afterlife. "Justice must be spoken," Sarah whispered, fading back into the shadows. "Only then will we be free." Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. She understood now. The house wasn't just haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by the silence. The truth of what had happened here had never truly been acknowledged. The guilt of Josiah Moore, the twisted obsession of Montgomery, and the pain of Sarah had festered, left unspoken, creating a cycle that had trapped them all. She had to speak it. She had to set it free. With trembling hands, Eliza began to speak, her voice growing steady as she recounted the events she had learned about the history of the Moore family, their struggles, the obsession that Montgomery had harbored for Sarah, and the unspoken guilt that had consumed Josiah. She spoke of the torment of how the house had become a prison for all the pain and suffering that had occurred within it. And as she spoke, she felt the weight lifting slowly, as if the house were exhaling a long-held breath. As she finished speaking, there was a long, deafening silence. And then, the air seemed to shift again. The room grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting from her chest. The house felt different, emptier, lighter. It was as though a long-standing tension had finally been released, the cycle broken. And then the whisper stopped. For the first time since she had entered the house, the silence was no longer filled with anguish. It was peaceful. The house was no longer alive with the echoes of torment. The spirits of Sarah Moore and her family had been freed. Eliza stood in the center of the room, her body trembling as the last remnants of the house's heavy energy faded away. She felt the presence of Sarah, but it wasn't the same as before. There was no fear, no urgency, only a deep sense of peace. "Thank you." Sarah's voice whispered a soft, gentle sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We are free." Eliza could feel the warmth of the house, the lightness that had replaced the suffocating heaviness. The house, once a prison, had become a sanctuary. Its secrets finally revealed, its spirits set free. But there was something more. Eliza turned toward the window, and for the first time, she saw the town of Villisca in a new light. The fog had lifted. The dark shadows that had once clung to the town seemed to dissipate, as though the house's curse had lifted from the very land itself. As Eliza left the room, she felt something stir in her, a deep, resonating sense of relief. The house would no longer haunt her. It would no longer haunt anyone. The story of the Moore family had been told, the truth spoken, and the ghosts of the past could now move on. She stepped outside into the crisp evening air, feeling the weight of the past slip away. The Villisca Axe murder house, though still standing, was no longer a place of horror. It had been transformed, its tragic history finally acknowledged and released. And as Eliza walked away from the house, she knew that it had fulfilled its purpose. The truth had been spoken. The spirits were free, and the house at last could rest. Eliza's life, after the events at the Villisca Axe murder house, was nothing short of transformative. She returned to her work as a historian, her understanding of the power of history and memory deepened by the experiences she had lived through. Yet she couldn't fully escape the feeling that the house in some way would always be a part of her. It was as though the whispers, now finally silenced, had left an indelible mark on her soul, while the house itself remained quiet, its dark energy no longer suffocating. Eliza often found herself returning to the quiet streets of Villisca, drawn by the sense of closure she had provided to the spirits who had suffered for so long. The house, though still standing, no longer carried the same oppressive weight. But every time Eliza passed by, she felt the urge to stop to look at the house, and remember what had been done. The town of Villisca, in turn, began to change. The legacy of the Moore family, though still present in the stories, passed down through generations, no longer defined the town. People continued to visit, but now they came not to experience the terror of the house, but to reflect on the strength of the human spirit, on the power of truth, redemption, and forgiveness. The house had become a symbol of healing, of broken bonds mended, of souls finally set free. In the years that followed, Eliza found herself writing a book, one that would serve as the final chapter in the story of the Villisca axe murders, a book that recounted not just the details of the murders, but the journey of understanding, of empathy, and the importance of speaking the unspoken truths that so often haunt us. She wrote of the house's power, the way it had absorbed the pain of its occupants, and how it had finally been freed by the acknowledgement of the deep, hidden emotional wounds that had festered for so long. It wasn't just about uncovering the past. It was about recognizing the complexities of human suffering and how our actions, our regrets, and our brokenness can reverberate through time, affecting not only ourselves, but those who come after us. As Eliza continued her work, she received letters from those who had read her book, people who had come to visit the Villisca house after its transformation. They wrote of feeling a deep sense of peace when they entered the space, of a heavy weight lifting off their shoulders, as if the house itself had become a reflection of their own personal struggles and triumphs. Eliza, however, knew that the healing that had taken place was not only because of the house itself, it was because the town, the world, had finally recognized the truth. It was the act of speaking the painful stories aloud, of sharing the hidden pieces of history, that had allowed for peace to settle in the hearts of those who had been affected. The house was not a place of horror anymore. It had become a place of understanding, of compassion, of redemption. In 2090, more than 20 years after Eliza's work in Villisca, she stood at the site of the house once more. The once decaying structure had been meticulously preserved, a memorial to the Moore family and all those who had suffered. A plaque was placed at the front bearing the names of the Moore family and the acknowledgement of their tragic deaths. The house had become a place of reflection, where people came not to relive the horror, but to honor those who had died and to understand how the past shapes the future. Eliza, older, now had come full circle in her own healing. She stood before the house, her gaze soft but resolute. It had taken years, decades even, but she had come to terms with the fact that the house and the spirits it had contained would forever be part of her. And that was okay, because in the end, it wasn't about fear. It was about the courage to confront the past, the willingness to heal, and the understanding that even the most painful histories could lead to redemption. As she turned away from the house for the final time, Eliza knew one thing: the Villisca axe murder house had fulfilled its purpose. It had witnessed terrible pain, but it had also witnessed the power of truth, of speaking the unspeakable, of giving voice to the silent victims who had lived in its shadow. The house would no longer stand as a dark memory, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and to the truth that no matter how deep the wounds, there is always a way to heal. And with that, the story of the Villisca axe murders and the house that had borne witness to so much came to a close. The house, forever changed, stood silently in the now peaceful town of Villisca, a place of history, of tragedy, and ultimately of hope. Though the years had passed, and the story of the Villisca axe murder house had woven its way into the fabric of history, some stories, some places refused to let go completely. Even with the years of healing and the peace that had settled over Villisca, there was always a lingering presence, A quiet pull, like a breath held for far too long,